My guest today is Nicky Abdinor. You've probably read a little bit about her on the marketing. She's a clinical psychologist. I saw Nicky presenting for the first time at a speakers convention in 2011. I just want to put it to you that I have been to 35 speaker conventions where speakers speak to speakers. And I don't want to set Nicky up in any way, but I can tell you that when I saw her at our convention in 2011, she was certainly one of the best speakers that I have ever seen. Now, I just want to put something into perspective for you. We're in tough times. I think we all know that and we all appreciate that. But add these tough times to being born without arms. And just try and think for a moment what it must be like to live in a world. Look, birds don't have arms, and I mean, dogs and cats don't have arms either. But the point quite simply is, Nicky was born into a world that was made for people with arms. So how do you maintain a positive mindset if you haven't got arms? So ladies and gentlemen, my good friend, a speaker that I really admire, a clinical psychologist, a person with the most amazing mindset, I'd like you to please welcome Nicky Abdinor. Nicky, over to you.
Hello, Paul, and hi, everyone. It's so good to be here. And, you know, Paul, you've given away my secret, because I thought the one advantage of working online now is I can pretend I've got arms. Nobody sees me in full picture.
It's like you're at attention.
Yes, exactly. It's really an honor to be part of this. And yes, Paul is 100% right. He wrote me the most beautiful note that he passed me after I did my talk for the Professional Speakers Association years ago. And I can safely say, next to my TEDx talk, that was the most scary talk I ever gave to fellow speakers. And that note I've really treasured all these years, and it really motivated me to continue in this profession. So thanks, Paul.
You're very welcome.
Fantastic. So for me, something I've recognized very strongly as a clinical psychologist and as a speaker is how things have just so drastically changed overnight. And I'm one of many people, I'm sure, on this call that is adapting to online work. And I can say it's been quite a challenge as a therapist, where so much of our human connection is being face-to-face and in the same room. But also as a speaker, I know so many speakers are missing that audience and that connection. So today I really wanted to talk about how to adapt our mindset to be more positive about online work. Because one thing that I've noticed is one of our greatest barriers is that we've got this post-lockdown mindset. And the post-lockdown mindset is that we're all waiting to get started once things go back to normal. I've had it in my therapy practice. People say, I'll carry on with therapy post-lockdown when I can see you in your office. Or as speakers, we are hearing from conferences, we're going to reschedule the conference post-lockdown. But each week we see more and more, and what's happening around the world is that if we decide to put everything on hold post-lockdown, we might be old and gray before that really becomes a positive space to be in. So work out what your resistances are. And I know that's what we're talking about today, that might be making you think, like, let me wait till post-lockdown. It's time to act now and use what we have. That's a huge philosophy in life for me, is to always focus on what we do have, not what we don't have. And I think that that's helped me adapt to my personal situation of having a physical disability.
The question I want to ask is, what trends are you noticing regards coping with the current pandemic? Which direction are things going?
Well, something that I've noticed, which I think is really interesting in my practice as a clinical psychologist, I'm finding that people who experienced anxiety disorders pre-COVID-19 seem to, in some ways, be coping much better than the average person out there. And a lot of conversations have happened around that, because there were certain people that I see for therapy that I was quite concerned about when lockdown started. And I was quite interested to see that they seem to be adapting the best. And what they said to me is, we've been afraid of the worst case scenario all our lives, and here it is. So that's number one. And number two, they said to me, it's such a relief that people can identify with the fears and the uncertainties and maybe sometimes the irrational thoughts I've had. And now we're in this together. So it's quite interesting to see that people have had that approach. But I do think in a general healthy population, many of us that have never experienced anxiety before, well, I want to reframe that. I don't think anybody in this world has never experienced anxiety, but people who have never had significant distress from an anxiety disorder, they're finding it exceptionally tough because they don't know how to deal with these emotions. They haven't been waking up in the middle of the night worrying about worst case scenarios. They are finding themselves short of breath and starting to worry, am I infected? So I think it's interesting to see like this shared trauma that we all dealing with, how we approaching it in different ways. And ultimately, it just shows us how much human connection and support is so necessary, whoever you are out there. You now need it more than ever.
So in a sense, Nicky, those that have been dealing with a lot of adversity in their lives up to the advent of the lockdown and the pandemic, in a sense, they seem to be a little bit more resilient because they are in the mindset of dealing with difficulty.
Yes, and I certainly don't want to generalize. I mean, everybody's got the unique experience, but if I had to think about my own situation, about having a physical disability, I've always said to people that I think that I had an advantage being born without arms. And the reason I say that, people always think I'm crazy to say such a thing. But for me, it feels so strongly that because I was born with such an obvious limitation from an early age, and thank goodness I had parents, even though they were completely overwhelmed by what I would need growing up and what would my capabilities be. But I'm so grateful that from the start, we knew exactly the challenges that I would have.
Yeah.
So we built and found ways to compensate for that. And I often think that most of us, our limitations are often in our heads, and we don't always know what they are. And you at such an advantage when you know exactly what your limitations are, and you can work out solutions and practical ways to overcome them.
Sure. So now, just bearing all that in mind, the fact that you've dealt with difficult situations all the time, you're living in a world where everything's designed for people that have got hands, that can open doors, that can undress themselves easily, that can do things quickly, that can just get themselves a glass of water if they want. We're in a situation now where we aren't allowed to meet people, we aren't allowed to get together. What do you think's happening to people in terms of their resistance to going online? What is making it difficult, and what is creating the barriers for them, and how can they overcome them?
I think often, especially when I'm thinking about work situations, so whether it's us as speakers needing to be able to present our content online, or even as a consultant or a therapist doing one-on-one sessions online, I think our greatest barrier, as I said, it's the lockdown mentality, but it's also our own resistance. So I've recently done some webinars on online therapy to registered psychologists, and we really dug deep to find that the people that are really battling to move their practice or their work online are the ones that are actually quite resistant to it themselves. So they're telling themselves things like, oh, it's not the same. It's not as good. The connection doesn't always work. And when I say connection, not necessarily Wi-Fi, although, you know, that can happen, but the human connection.
That's it. Yeah.
And it's, again, for me, I use the disability model around that. You know, I know personally a psychologist who is blind, And he's one of the most incredible psychologists.
Mm.
Now, for myself, if I had to lose my sight, I know that I would really battle in therapy, because so much is about what you can see in front of you.
Yeah.
But this blind psychologist, again, knowing what his limitations are, he's got such incredible perceptions about people and instincts.
Yeah.
So why don't we all think about that? Like, what extra senses can we use to still build that human connection, even through a computer screen?
Well, I've always had the view that if I was the CEO of a large company, the only person that I would allow to work on my switchboard would be somebody who is blind, because their
Yes.
sense of hearing is so far heightened. You very often get a situation where somebody phones in and for the first time in 2 years, and they'll say, "Oh, well, hello, Mr. Ardendorf, how are you doing? And how did you recognize my voice?" And doesn't want to let on that maybe that's his most developed sense. But I think we
Yes.
tend to do that, is we develop the side of us that we need to use the most. And we're
Yes.
generally lazy. We use our sight for just about everything. There are stats that suggest that more than 4/5 of our experience of the world is done through our eyes. So fascinating. Here is another question for you. How do we cultivate a positive mindset when there is so much uncertainty and negativism in the world?
Yes. Well, something that I've done on a personal level is I've cut out the news. And you might think that maybe I'm a little bit of an ostrich. I'm keeping up to date every now and then with trusted sources. But I've stopped watching the news because I found it put me in a really negative space. And as a psychologist, I need, my mental health is absolutely crucial.
Yeah.
And I cannot tell you how that has helped my approach. Just my general, I know I'm very realistic. I always say to people, I might be an optimist, but I'm a very realistic optimist. And I think for us all to cultivate that healthy optimism and positive mindset is actually to be able to feel all levels of emotion. I don't believe that it's possible to be happy all the time. Unless you're on some kind of a drug or a morphine drip, I don't think it's possible. And we've got to stop being afraid of feeling other emotions. It's normal to feel positive and negative emotions, but most importantly, it's about experiencing healthier negative emotions. So an example of an unhealthy negative emotion would be depression, but a healthier version of that negative emotion would be sadness. So if we lose somebody in our life and we're going through grief, it wouldn't be realistic to say, like, I don't want to feel sad, I want to feel happy. Sadness is a healthy negative emotion. So if you want to really embrace a positive mindset, for me, it's about allowing yourself to feel different emotions. Too often, we're feeling maybe a bit anxious, or we're feeling disappointed, we're feeling guilty, and we so badly want to push away those negative emotions that then we don't feel anything. And one of the most famous psychologists of all time, next to Freud, was Carl Jung, and he said the brilliant words that happiness would actually lose its meaning if it weren't balanced by sadness. So I think that that's one big point, is to recognize that we need to allow our emotions to flow. And when we are feeling a negative emotion, like, how do we access strategies to be able to lift that emotion but still feel it? So in the morning, to be more mindful of how you're feeling, and think about strategies that you can work to lift that emotion. Maybe it's exercise, perhaps it's phoning a particular person in your life that you can really get things off your chest. Perhaps it's just getting in the shower and having cold water all over your body. It works. So ultimately, the last thing I wanted to say about cultivating this optimistic mindset or positive mindset is also to recognize there's a psychologist based in Australia, and I just love her work, and her name is Tracy Hunter. And she was talking about how, as young people, we are so optimistic. You know, we believe anything is possible. And I know I've got video clips of myself as a baby. You might see them on my TEDx talk, where I just didn't think I had any limitations. And we were all like that. And what Tracy Hunter says, well, what happens to us that we block that optimism as we grow older? So in my mind, it's because we start to compare ourselves to others, and then we doubt our own abilities. But what she said further is that ultimately we're blocking a vulnerable state, because in order to be optimistic, you have to have a certain level of vulnerability. To be optimistic about our speaking business, for instance. If I had to say, well, I believe that I can convert my in-person talks to online presentations, that opens me up to the vulnerability that I might fail, that there might be setbacks, that I might not get everything right the first time. So it's about accepting that vulnerable state and being okay if it doesn't work out as you planned.
Well, I want to come straight back to what you've just opened up about online speaking, presenting, or conferencing. But just before we go there, we've got an interesting question from Mariette. She says, I find that many people cannot name their real emotions. How would you encourage this conversation?
Well, Mariette, I think the starting point is to recognize that there are so many emotions and words that we use. I often have a conversation with a particular client who always says she feels bad. And bad isn't necessarily an emotion. So I always give her a hard time and I say, well, what does that mean? What is bad? I mean, I think she has about 20 emotions that fall under the word bad. So there are emotion charts that you can even find online. I mean, everything is so accessible. And I think it's a great idea to be able to point out that emotion. I mean, we're using emoticons all the time, but sometimes there's a miscommunication where we're using the wrong emoticon, or we're saying something really difficult and just putting a smiley, laughing, crying face. And what does that really mean? So it's about attaching words. And I think that that's a starting point to really understand what is the word that fits how I'm feeling? And maybe there are a couple of words.
You know, it's maybe not a bad idea every day when we wake up to just choose a word. Just one word. We used to call that, when we ran our team building conferences, having a seed word. And that word is going to be with you the whole day. And obviously to try and make sure that it's a positive word, because you just keep kind of flowing into that word as circumstances hit you during the day.
Yes. And if it's a bad word, to understand, like, where is that coming from? What is triggering this feeling within me? And what can I do to change my thoughts about it? Or do I need to accept it? That there's nothing I can really do to change this, but I want to feel different emotions.
Right. So Nicky, many of us now are in a situation where we're forced to go online to speak to our clients. And we're in a sense forced to use platforms such as Zoom. Some people call it Zoom, or whatever. But we're forced to. But yet there seems to be some kind of psychological resistance. We kind of feel overwhelmed by the technology. How do you feel we can create that positive mindset and just persevere through all the overwhelming things which seem to be on top of us, and the nervousness about going online and maybe messing up?
My feeling is that we are all learning, and the only way we're going to get through this is if you just jump into it. And that's what I've done. I've done 2 webinars in the last week. And the first webinar that I did, I just got this idea, like bounced out of bed on a Thursday morning, and I thought, this is a webinar that I need to present. There's a huge need within my profession. And then I sat and I made the advert, and I decided I'm not going to put it forward to, I will be presenting this in a week or 2 weeks. Now is the time when we have to act quickly. And people aren't keen to put things in their diary for 2-3 weeks time. They have no idea where they'll be or what will be happening. So I made a a pact with myself that I was going to do it in 3 days' time. And it was an incredibly scary experience. I mean, half the time you don't even know if people are listening to you. You're just like staring at the screen in your bedroom. I mean, it's the most bizarre experience. But until you do that, you actually don't know. So stop thinking that you need to be perfect at it, because there's no perfection. And I think sometimes my feeling is being authentic is number one.
Yep.
So if you've got all the lights and the cameras and the over the top visuals, I feel, and it's the same when you're on stage as well, I don't buy into that as much. I feel like I just want to connect with a real person and understand who they are. I mean, the most incredible thing was to share with this group of psychologists that I'm sitting in my bedroom doing therapy. Freud would have had an absolute field day with that one. But people were saying, I don't have a professional space. Create it.
Yeah.
Don't hesitate.
Well, in a sense, when you're starting off, make do with what you've got. So, Nicky, I've got an important question for you, and I don't think it's necessary to rush through your answer so that we end at exactly 1:30. But can you share, let's say, 3 skills, okay, that we can work on now to adapt to a more positive mindset? If you've only got 2, that's fine.
I've got 3. Sure. And interestingly, these 3 skills are things that I've felt for many years are important, but even more important now. So the first one is to focus on what you can do, not on what you can't. As so often we always, like I said earlier, we're focusing on what we don't have or what's not within our control. And I know it's a message that we hear so often, but what does it really mean? And it means us understanding what are disabilities. They might not be visual, but they may be hidden disabilities. What's blocking us from adopting a positive mindset? So focus on your strengths. Second point is to learn to tolerate uncertainty. Now, in my work with anxiety, I always say it's almost like a screensaver in your brain. If you think about worry, things that you're anxious about, they're all future oriented. We don't worry about the past. Sometimes we tend to dwell on the past, which can lead to depression, but we worry about the future. And the thing is about the future, none of us knows what is going to happen. So sometimes we end up focusing our entire happiness and quality of life on needing to know exactly what is going to happen in the future, and that's not possible. So when you learn to tolerate uncertainty, you are more mindful and you live in the present. And I always say that if you cannot enjoy today, well, you can't enjoy today if you're always worrying about tomorrow. So that's my second point. And my third point that you're nicely putting in the chat box is to adopt an attitude of gratitude. So I believe so strongly that it's not necessarily what we have that determines our happiness, but how we approach it and how we perceive it. So that's why sometimes you will meet somebody who seems to have so much less than you, who is radiating joy. And then you'll see somebody who is perceived to have everything and is miserable. And that's because people who are truly happy are the ones that are grateful, not the people that have everything. So I think we've got, and more so now than ever, is that as South Africans, but I feel like this is a global phenomenon, is that we are very quick to complain, but when do we actually show gratitude and appreciation? So something that I decided about a year ago, and it's totally changed my approach to things and my mood and health in general, is that every time I need to make a complaint about something, whether it's service provision or something that's gone wrong, I make sure to give 2 to 3 compliments to service providers or people that have made a positive impact or are doing excellent service, customer care. And that is just changing our mindset. So often we're quick to complain, but how often do we actually show gratitude and appreciation to somebody who's done a good job or also has made us feel appreciated? So those are my 3 points for you today.